right, welcome back to Swim Experts. We continue our look at the Athlete Development Matrix. Today, Manager of Paramedical Services Johnny Fuller joins us, and we're looking at the physical capacity pillar. Johnny, we'll start with this. What are some of the skills and foundational learnings that are found in the physical capacity pillar of the Athlete Development Matrix?
Some of those interventions that we talk about are those key training and performance qualities. We call them the 5 S's: skill, strength, stamina, speed, suppleness or flexibility, together with some other key considerations like nutrition and hydration, rest and regeneration. What the physical capacity pillar also gives us is insight into periods whereby we can maximize the impact of those particular interventions. So we talk about these windows of opportunity or these windows of trainability. Personally, I prefer the phrase these periods of accelerated adaptation. I think that probably explains it a little bit better. But these are periods in an athlete's growth and development where we can take advantage of certain points in that maturation process and insert some of these interventions and get maximum benefit from that.
I want to talk a little bit about specialization. Can you tell us a little bit about the concept of specialization, and are there any dangers for early specialization with athletes?
It's easy for you to say specialization. Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's very relevant in swimming, which historically and to a great extent as well, still currently is an early specialization sport. Unfortunately, all the evidence and all the science points towards not specializing early in one particular sport. Everything points towards keeping a more diverse, a broader range of fundamental skills. Actually makes it a lot easier to specialize further down the line when we're asked to adopt more specialized, complex skills when we are specializing in a sport. If you neglect those early skills, it makes it infinitely harder to specialize further down the line in a particular sport. So it's certainly something that needs to be identified and addressed early. There are ways in which to do it in swimming. Certainly you find in swimming that there's a tendency to specialize early, but you can still get these general physical preparation exercises integrated into the trainings, into the training mix. You know, be that strength and conditioning in the activation process before you get into the pool. Maybe with some cross training circuits in and around training. So there's opportunities to get these fundamental motor skills into the training mix.
I want to talk about good posture. I think we all grew up with our parents telling us don't slouch, make sure to stand up straight. Is that the same with athletes? Are we talking about the same type of posture? What's good posture when it comes to athlete development?
Every time you talk about posture, everyone just sits back in the chair, right? And sort of like we start to check ourselves out in the video. It's a loaded question. I think first and foremost, we need to understand that the body is an incredible instrument, and you can achieve incredible feats of athletic performance with imbalances, with misalignments, with impairments, and we see examples of that day in, day out. So this concept of everybody needing perfect posture in order to be a superstar athlete is inaccurate. Far be it for me to walk up to Rafael Nadal and tell him that he has to work on getting some symmetry in the size of his biceps because that's important from a postural point of view. I think if you think of like one of the most common postural deformities, something like rounded shoulders, where the pecs are shortened, you have lengthening through the tissues in and around the scapula and the mid-back. That postural deviation or that postural misalignment, if you translate that into the pool and it's not corrected, or you don't work to correct it, you translate that into the pool, not only the muscles shortened and lengthened, unable to work optimally, you're also going to find that joints are not functioning as they are designed to function. So you are going to have some kind of bias one way or the other, which means that you aren't going to be able to perform the mechanics of the stroke quite as you want to. So posture is important. It's not the be all and end all, but certainly in a sport like swimming, working towards good posture is certainly beneficial, and it's best to address that earlier than to try and correct it later on when some of these misalignments and imbalances and impairments are much harder to correct.
I want to talk a little bit about core training, another big piece to athlete development. You did a great video, which you can find on Swimming Canada's YouTube, about a lot of the training that the high performance swimmers are doing, dry land training. Talk a little bit about the concept of core training and what are the most important things about core training from an athlete perspective and from an athlete development perspective.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, core. We've just talked about posture, and core leads on really nicely from posture. Core's absolutely key. It's one of the real big elements that I'm really keen on and keen to kind of push. Everything is effectively anchored in your core. All movement is initiated from your core at some level or another. If you have a think about kids that are a lot younger and you have a look at the way they hold themselves, the posture, you try and get them to perform a standard plank. Their core, both the outer core and the inner core, is really strong. What we tend to find is that as we kind of progress and as we get older, certainly the deeper core structures become weaker. We become more reliant on global muscles rather than those deeper core muscles, which is generally inefficient in terms of what we want to achieve as athletes. Core in swimming is really important. If you think about holding form in the water and reducing what we call form drag, which is the profile of a swimmer in the water, the core is the major contributor to that. So in terms of its ability to help us hold streamline, and in terms of us keeping the hips high in the water, core is really important in achieving both of those two concepts and reducing form drag. I just mentioned then about the deeper core structures and the outer core, and I think that's a really important point to try and raise here, is that it's really worth your while focusing on deeper core activation. So we're talking about transverse abdominis, pelvic floor, erector spinae muscles, those deeper core structures, so that we can create a foundation for which everything else is built upon. So it's not just training the six pack and working the abs. It's a lot deeper than that, and it's getting that foundation set from which everything else can springboard from.
Good stuff. If you say let's not train the six pack more, I'm down with that advice. So talk a little bit about strength training. I think a lot of people, general public, even high performance athletes can relate to strength training. When should athletes start thinking about strength training? Is there an age that's too early, too late? Talk about how strength training plays into athlete development.
So when to start? It's the $1 million question, and it's certainly it's certainly a debate that has raged on for years and years and years. I think thankfully we're getting to that point now where we're debunking that myth about strength training too early is a bad thing, and that it contributes to stunted growth or increased injury potential further down the line. The general consensus now is that well-structured strength training as early as 6 to 7 years old is actually beneficial in terms of contributing to the overall long-term athlete development. The rider on that is that it's individual specific. So if you are working at strength training with young kids, you've got to make sure that they know how to accept and understand instruction, and that has to be from kind of qualified professionals, that they understand safety, and they understand the parameters around safety, and that they can illustrate some kind of competency in terms of balance and control. I think if we can tick those boxes, then this adage that if they're old enough to take part in organized sport, then they're also old enough to take part in a structured and controlled strength and conditioning program. I think what we need to consider then is, what are we talking about in terms of strength training? And we're not talking about 6 and 7 year olds going and doing some Olympic lifting program. Strength training is, or the understanding of strength training in this context is that it's any type of resistance training. So be that body weight, medicine balls, resistance bands, fixed weights, free weights, the full spectrum. So we would look at introducing simple body weight exercises at the earlier age. So we concentrate on, the neural adaptations at that early stage. And then as we kind of go through some of those windows of trainability and those windows of opportunity, be that, the onset of puberty, the peak height velocity, or onset of growth spurts, when we identify those, then we might want to layer on different elements of strength training at those stages. So it needs to be done gradually. It needs to be done carefully. The physical capacity pillar in the ADM has this in a fair bit of detail, and it makes suggestions in all these different areas. But the general rule is we can start early, as long as we start smartly, and as long as we progress gradually and put the right emphasis in the right places, then it can be very, very successful in preparing an athlete for long-term success.
And last question about the athlete development matrix. Of course, we're talking about the physical capacities pillar with manager of paramedical services, Johnny Fuller. Last question. I'm sure you'll get no argument about this aspect from any of your younger or teenage swimmers, and that, of course, is sleep. Of course, science tells us that much of the body repairing and recovery happens when we sleep, but in your opinion, and in your with your background, how much sleep do you need, and why is sleep so important to athlete development?
There's no substitute for it. We all like it. We all understand that it's important. You alluded to it in your question that, we know that you have this process of regeneration and adaptation that takes place only when we're sleeping. And yet most of us don't get anywhere near as much sleep as we should be getting. Now, I have an excuse. I'm not a high performance athlete, and so I can get away with having some kind of sleep deficit to a certain degree. But certainly when we're talking about it in terms of athletic development, and we're talking about athletes that are progressing towards some form of mastery in their sport, then I feel that we need to be a lot better in terms of educating and reinforcing the importance of sleep as we go through all of those stages of the LTAD. If you have a look at what the evidence tells us, at the early fundamental stage, we're talking 10, 11 hours of sleep and a 30-minute nap. And then at the other end of the spectrum, by the time we get to, the train to compete, we're still looking at 8 to 10 hours plus a nap. And if the evidence is right, we think that top level athletes are in some kind of deficiency of up to 2 hours a night. So whereas we should be getting 50, 60, 70 hours a week, we're well short of that. And that can have huge implications in terms of mental and physical capacities of athletes. So we need to be better. I know I always bring forward a little bit of knowledge that was passed on to me in terms of this deficiency of sleep, or this absence of this 2 hours a night effectively equates to having a 0.05 microgram blood alcohol level, and you're walking around with that. So imagine the impairments of that in terms of your physical and mental capacities as it affords to your sport. So we need to be better at educating the importance of sleep.
Johnny Fuller has been with us, manager of paramedical services with Swimming Canada, talking physical capacities pillar as part of the athlete development matrix. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome. Thanks, Jordan.